Sermon title today, A Weird Assessment. A Weird Assessment. And it refers to mainly to the evaluation, the assessment that we find of King Omri, mentioned in the first passage that we listened to in the book of Micah. Lesser well-known verses that follows that, I think, well-known passage, what does the Lord require of you, and then it goes on with quite a condemnation because Israel was doing the statutes, was following the example of King Omri, which got a very bad rap right through the Bible. There's not much written about him, mostly short verses, but very straight talk, and no ambivalence in the condemnation of Omri as the worst apple in the basket, the worst king that ever lived, according to the Bible, in Israel. Keep that in mind. I will return to that at some stage. Can't exactly say when, but I hope I'll get there again. When Krista and I and MJ just arrived in the US, we, like all new immigrants, try to do things that are free, that you don't have to pay for. And coming from South Africa, it was especially so with the exchange rate being that stage almost or between 7 and 9, depending on what happened in South Africa. So you sell your house and then you can buy a car here. And it was a bit tough, without a credit record. You had to live cash. From utilities that you couldn't connect because you're an immigrant without a credit record to buying a car. It had to happen in cash. But what was good was the free stuff. And one thing that we found was a TV channel that was free called Link TV out of California, where it was based, which was like many things coming from California, strange and weird and perhaps sometimes dangerous, depending on where you stand in the spectrum of especially political opinion in the nation. But we found this refreshing because in the first place it was free, so you watch it. What was also very refreshing was the business model. It worked on a subscription basis, which we obviously didn't do. We watched the first, I think it was free 3 months, and then they blocked you, and after a few months you tried again, and it was free again. So we watched it intermittently for quite a number of years. They didn't have any advertisements, no ads, just content. And what was also interesting was this network offered during, I specifically remember the Iraq War, the second Iraq War. It offered material of 12 different networks from across the world. So almost in real time, or within at least the same day, you could watch perspectives from Israeli TV, Jordanian TV, the KGB TV, Russian TV, Lebanon TV, Saudi Al Jazeera, and then also 2 or 3 American networks. So it was very interesting to see the same battle or the same event being reported on, and I was often perplexed to think that this can't be the same place and the same incident that these different networks are reporting on. It brought home the severe differences that is created in the reporting of news and what is presented to the audience. It was very, very similar, I think, to the world that we live in today. I make a point of watching CNN and then also watching Fox News. And I look at it and say, well, there must be different things that they're reporting on because, it can't be true. from both sides. Or A cannot be B as well. It's either A or B. But let it be. We find something similar in the view on King Omri. You have the biblical view, which I've shared a bit with you. King Omri was the worst of the worst, a bad guy. And then the verdict is based on, because he didn't do what God wanted him to do. He was not a godly king. He was not a godly ruler. In the passage in Micah, we find a description of what God requires. And then the question is asked, should I give all these rams and all these burnt offerings? Should I even give my firstborn as an offering to get favor with God? Well, what does God require? When is God satisfied that you are obeying His will? And then those three powerful statements: to love kindness, to be compassionate, to seek justice, and to walk humbly with your God. And then the description: you will suffer in the future, Israel, because you are not doing that, but you are doing what King Omri did and what he used to lead people to. He has a very bad way of ruling. That is the biblical verdict on King Omri. In the non-biblical sources, we find a totally different perspective on King Omri. Like in the stelae or the stone pillars used by especially emperors and rulers to write their history about their own kingdoms and statements about their achievements on, we find references from the time to King Omri and his dynasty. King Omri came to power in a sort of a strange setup where there was a war, and the leader of half of the chariots of Israel killed the head of the army and declared himself king. And he went back to the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, which was in Tirzah at that stage, and he said, all right, I'm king now. And then Omri, who was also involved in the battle, he said, no, you're not king. So he went to Tirzah, and after 7 days, Zimri set the palace alight, and he burned himself to death. And then Omri became king. But it took another 4 years to round up all the recalcitrant elements to establish his kingdom. But then he ruled for 12 years. And it was a very interesting 12 years, because in that time, the northern kingdom of Israel actually became a regional power. There was peace all around, even with the southern kingdom of Israel at that stage, Judah. There was peace between northern and southern kingdom. There was peace with Sidon. There was peace with the two other world powers, the main ones, the superpowers at that stage, which was Assyria and Egypt. Omri was a good politician and a very able administrator. He established a solid kingdom, brought peace to the region and stability, and the region actually flourished. So that was the references outside the Bible to Omri. Here is a substantial kingdom developing. Here is a good ruler. Here is a fine politician that is able, through his diplomatic ability, to establish a fine kingdom and to bring peace and prosperity to Israel. Not so much him after the 12 years, but the people who followed him, King Ahab, etc. Dynasty that lasted for about 50 years. The interesting thing about King Omri, just a footnote, I don't know what it's worth, but it's interesting to me that he's the first king in the Bible whose tribal origin is not mentioned. Other kings, they would say, he's from the tribe of Manasseh or from the tribe of Judah or so forth. No. The Bible doesn't mention King Omri's tribal origin or his tribal home. So most scholars think that he was probably a mercenary, perhaps from Arabic origin. But we don't know, and that's besides the point. So we have these two verdicts on King Omri. The biblical one, it says this is a very bad guy. He's the worst. And because of what he did, Israel will suffer. And because of what the people that followed him as rulers of Israel did and will do, Israel will suffer. He brought prosperity. The economy blossomed under him, but he was a bad guy, morally corrupt, etc., according to the Bible. He didn't follow in the footsteps of what the prophets laid out and said, right, this is the way you should walk. He didn't obey the commandments of God. That is the verdict. And then on the other hand, the verdict of the world that says this is a good king. You know, he's able to establish a good administration, a substantial regional power that developed under his rule and his guidance. That is a strange assessment for a very successful king. To always get this one-liners that crucify him and say, bad guy, the worst. Whereas he was actually, I think, in the real world, the most successful king Israel had. A very able guy, as a king, as a ruler. The assessment of the king of God's people, the assessment of God's people, is not an assessment that is done with criteria that the world normally uses to evaluate or assess anything. We find a good example of this in the life and the work and the dynasty and the heritage of King Omri. Because even though he brought prosperity, prophets like Micah, like Amos especially, Jeremiah, and almost all the prophets coming from that period was very harsh on him, saying, under your rule there was no justice, there was no kindness. You did not walk humbly with your God. You did all the other stuff right, but that, the most critical performance area, you didn't perform in that area to follow the law of God. Most of you are probably familiar with assessments in the workplace. And when I have to do it, I try to focus on the critical performance areas, and I'm trying to teach MJ that as well. So if I ask you to do 10 things, pick the ones that you know I want to get done quickly, otherwise I'll be upset. You can pick 2 and do them, and I'll like you, but don't do the other 8 and leave those 2, then I'll still be upset with you. Critical performance areas. And that is where King Omri failed, according to the Bible. He did not perform in what was critical to be a good king in the eyes of God and according to the law of God. Now that is still relevant for us today. We listen to Jesus or a take of the Gospel of Luke on Jesus when he spoke in the synagogue in Nazareth and read from the scroll of Isaiah. Say, this is why I came, to set the captives free, to change the situation of the poor, to bring them good news, etc., etc. And that is a very difficult word throughout the ages, whether it's biblical times or whether it's our time to hear. That the people of God are called not only to an individual piety and compassion as an individual, but also the structural stuff, the societal stuff, to be compassionate in that way as well. To express individual compassion also in the way that we structure our society. And today it's especially difficult. And wiser people than myself would have probably said, yeah, let's put that on halt, on pause, until the climate is better to introduce again to the congregation social justice issues. But I'm not a wise man. Krista always says I'm the most strong-willed person she's ever met in her life. And that's not a compliment. But I take my call seriously, and I'm also serious about us as God's people and as this covenant community to do what I believe we should do. To take the words of the prophets and the words of Jesus seriously, and to find the common ground that we can agree on as God's people. This is what the love of God means expressed in society and in a corporate way. Because when you look at social justice, it is not saying, give the hungry man food to eat. Yes, that should be done. But it is also asking the question, why is he hungry? Is he hungry due to his own laziness? Then he should get the move on and, find a job if there is a job to be found and work. But if he is hungry because the deck is stacked against him, then the people of God should take note of that and should take heed and say, what can we do? So that we do not run out of resources to feed the hungry, but that we can also try to look at the underlying cause. And again, I realize the sensitivity of it, but I'm also very hopeful that we as God's people will be willing to accept the challenge to say, let us put Democratic and Republican and whatever category of political affiliation you want to identify aside. And as God's people say, let us find what we regard as being a compassionate way, a way that loves kindness, and a way where we can walk humbly with our God. And as God's people, not only journey with God, but together with one another and say, this is what we think we should do. It is a difficult time to do it. But if we cannot succeed in doing that, I do not have much hope for the future of this nation and of the world. Therefore, I keep the flame of hope in my heart alive that it will happen here. Last week we formed a steering committee after a meeting, social justice, and I've spent many hours in individual conversations with people who are concerned about it, saying, this is going to blow up. The time is not right. Let's leave this thing. Let's not destroy the unity of the congregation. And I persisted. In spite of all those conversations, or perhaps because of those conversations. And I always tried to say to them, I think people realize the sensitivity. And this should not be the whole life of the church, dominating everything. But it should be present in the life of the church, that we proceed with responsibility, also with kindness and compassion towards one another, but also loving justice and being willing to do what is right. The steering committee of the Social Justice Committee that will function under the Board of Mission, they will develop guidelines which will include that people should not speak for the church when they are not authorized to speak for the church. But we should also not silence voices of people who want to speak as individuals and to want to work on issues of social justice. So I look forward to this interesting part of the journey. And as I say, I'm hopeful. Like the candles, it was interesting to watch how they were lit. She's a mover. She came down this aisle. I thought that flame is going to go out before she reached the candles, but she did a good job and got them going. And in the same way, let us keep that flame of the love of God. Let us keep that burning. Not flickering, but burning brightly. And in that light, let us walk together as God's people, loving kindness, doing justice. That is the assessment that we should use for our lives individually and also as a church, as a covenant community. Are we living the kingdom? Are we doing God's love? That is the most important assessment that we should embrace, that yardstick. And let us grant each other the kindness to walk with tolerance, to grant each other the respect to listen. And let us also strengthen the hands and the knees so that we may do what is right and walk in the paths of righteousness. May God help us to do that as individuals, as a church. Amen.